Hello there, and welcome to the Thank You Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb. Today I'm joined once again by Doctors Rosenblatt and Scott Keith. This is the second episode in what will be I just want to say multi-week series in apologetics, because it'll be somewhere between 6 and 8. It just depends on how many questions we get or how quickly we deal with those questions. Sometimes I'll get a question that I think, oh, surely we'll take 30 minutes to cover that, and somehow somebody takes it down in 10 minutes, and I'm sort of sitting there looking at my notes like, what to do. So we'll see how that goes, but like I said, somewhere between 6 or 8 weeks for doing apologetics. One of the other things that I want to start the show off with is, again, a thank you to the people who, after last week, asking once again, went and rated the show on Apple Podcasts. I really appreciate that. We all do here. It's helping us bump up in those search results on iTunes, which, historically isn't a problem for us. We actually have quite a few episodes where if you search something similar to the title, we show up in that top 10 for the subject, especially, what's been a long-standing one, and it means we need to do another episode related to it, is our C.S. Lewis episode in Apple Podcasts comes up as the number 1 episode on C.S. Lewis if you search just his name in Apple Podcasts. And that's been for like 3 years now, and I'm pretty happy about that. I think that's pretty amazing, actually. That one's always been a little shocking to me because there's so many people not Christians even, interested in Lewis. And so, I've sort of expected things like maybe a university lecture that's turned into a podcast or something like that, or maybe a larger secular podcast on Lewis to take that spot, and they haven't. And so, I kind of want to keep it that way and get more of those episodes up there. And one of the most effective ways to do that is for people to go rate the show, to write a short review. It doesn't even have to be long. It could be 1 sentence with 5 stars. It's a computer working out the algorithms to try to bump us up in the results. And so any effort helps. And like I've said in the previous episodes, if you don't listen to your podcasts on Apple Podcasts, you can go do this from a web browser. If you have an iPhone, it's still really easy if you don't use Apple Podcasts to just go give a rating. I'm going to leave a link to our directory in Apple Podcasts in this episode show notes, and then you can just follow that. And like I said, it shouldn't take you any more than 3 to 5 minutes or something like that, and we really do appreciate your time doing that. Another portion of this is I want to thank you to everybody who has signed up to donate to 1517 via the Thinking Fellows. Those small, reoccurring, affordable monthly donations have been instrumental into keeping the show going and pursuing other projects at 1517. The beginning of the year is it's one of those crucial times for us where we get a sense of how people are feeling as we're rolling into things. And, seeing people say, hey, I'm going to support the show for this year and the years to come is really encouraging. And, that impact really does allow us to do new things on the show, and we appreciate that. All right, so episode 2, I want to dive into some of the really basic questions, which for some listeners are probably, don't check out. I think the answers are going to be pretty good to some of these, but one of the most basic questions I saw, and I thought it would be really good to cover this, was somebody saying, hey, I'm familiar with apologetics on sort of the grand academic or public scheme of things. He named Ravi Zacharias as an apologist. I forget the name, but he's also cited some famous Muslim apologists who he recognized as sort of doing an apologetics of Islam in the early 2000s. Maybe when Adam's back, he probably identified that right off the bat for us as well, and saying, hey, so I this is how I got into apologetics. Things like what Ravi was doing was really comforting to me as a Christian, but I'm sort of wondering now, is apologetics something that non-academics can do, somebody who's not trained in it can do? And if so, how?
I can answer that.
Yeah.
When Dr. Montgomery, for decades in different cities, did the series that became Sensible Christianity, it was for the laity. Sensible Christianity will be the greatest introduction to the whole field that you'll ever listen to. Grab that thing. Have one in your church library on CDs that people can play in their car or something. That one is the introduction for the laity. The clergy were always welcome, but it wasn't primarily designed for them. was designed for the laity in the same sort of way that C.S. Lewis wrote for the laity.
Yeah, in Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was saying on the last episode that Rod used to do this a lot. Adam does it more than I do, but even me to some extent, I spend a decent amount of time when I'm out speaking, going out to churches and doing basic apologetics in congregations for just the people. Some of the, and it's a typical congregational mix. You'll have some engineers in there. You'll have some teachers in there. You'll have people, secretaries, mechanics, electricians, whatever.
Yep.
And what I basically do is do a bit of a rework of sensible Christianity for them. And kind of just, depending on how much time I have, just kind of go through it. And so my answer to that is yes. And I would say that, and I think Adam would say the same thing if you were here, when he and I first learned some of the basics of this, we weren't what you would call academics yet. We were young college students. Trust me, being a college student doesn't make you an academic. It just, the basic answers are basic enough that anybody of a reasonable ability can grasp them without a problem.
And the apologetic questions, major ones, boil down to about 10.
Right.
This is not encyclopedic knowledge. The same questions in apologetics occur again and 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 again in different venues.
I would say, too, one of the, I don't know, I really don't know this person because this was, I sort of reached out on a new area we haven't reached out before. I went on a Reddit thread that's dedicated to Christian apologetics and threw that question out there, and that's where this listener asked this. And so the other thing is, because I don't really know where you are, I also say doing apologetics on the ground shouldn't be about going out there to just go prove some people wrong. Right, to go pick some fights and win them as for Christ or something like that.
Yep.
I really do think there's an orienting here where you have to, before you do this, or before it even comes to your front door, where you have to ask, what is the purpose of doing apologetics? And I don't know if we answered that directly in the last episode, but what is, besides just defending or proving that we're right, what is the actual purpose of apologetics within the Christian life?
Is absolutely to bring a person from not believing in Christ as their God and Lord to where they do. And we can't do that. Actually, that's going to be the Spirit of God working through the word of the gospel. But that's the goal, to bring them to Christ, particularly in his dying and rising.
And so apologetics it has to be paired to the proclamation of the gospel proper.
Yeah.
As a standalone, it really is, as you were saying before, it's really polemical. And like you also last episode were saying, sort of our attitude towards the internet, our involvement with social media has amplified this into other realms as well. But the main goal here is to preach the gospel and to sort of re-preach it even after the apologetics have been done, to sort of been listening for when that person needs to be absolved.
Yeah, in Sensible Christianity, Dr. Montgomery says a couple of really helpful things. First of all, he identifies apologetics as the intellectual branch of evangelism. So evangelism proper is just going out and sharing the gospel of Christ Jesus with a world that doesn't know it, right? So you're going in your daily conversations or whatever, and it comes up that you're a Christian, and somebody says, what does that mean? That you say, something to the effect that I believe Jesus Christ was a real person who was incarnate, lived a perfect life in my stead, died for my sins, rose again on the third day as my first fruits of my resurrection. And they say, well, that rising from the dead thing, is that like a miracle or something? And you say, yeah, that's absolutely, it's the miracle's miracle. And they answer, well, what? I don't believe miracles happen. And boom, you now have a question, right? Or an objection. And once you start answering, can miracles happen? Within that sort of, you're in the realm of apologetics. You're now in the realm of defending the faith. The other thing that he says frequently in Sensible Christianity is that, and I'll kind of paraphrase in my own words here. never think of going out and doing apologetics, right? What you're thinking about is going out and evangelizing. And the way Dr. Montgomery says that is, it's evangelism first and last. And I'll sometimes say it's evangelism first, second, third, middle, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and last, right? You're starting with the proclamation of Christ for the forgiveness of sins. You're ending with the proclamation of Christ for the forgiveness of sins. And along the way, you're answering questions as they come up. And objections as they come.
And that's really what we mean by evangelism too, is like the proper proclamation of Christ crucified for you.
Yeah, you're not evangelism seriously is not going out and telling people that Jesus changed your life.
No.
That's not evangelism.
And I think that's what a lot of people picture is sort of that personal testimony of how great my life is now that I'm a Christian.
Yeah, so the Greek word from which we get evangelism just means good news. But properly speaking, when we say go out and do evangelism, you're not talking about good news generally, right?
Yep.
That Jesus changed your life or that you just won a brand new Porsche. You're talking about the good news.
Yep.
The definite article, good news. What is the good news? The good news is that because of Christ's life, death, and resurrection for you, you will have life eternal with him. That's the good news. And any other good news is subordinate to that for sure.
Yeah, and there's lots of other good news or good things about being Christian or teachings or whatever. But that's our primary aim. That's what we're called to do. That's what we're called to share with not only outsiders but other Christians.
And with people who really aren't acquainted much with the biblical text, this is what the apostles did after Jesus' ascension.
That's the funniest thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That this is objected to all the time because this is the New Testament post the ascension of Christ.
I also think, part of this, you said that Montgomery said to a world that doesn't know it. And I'll run into a lot of Christians who sort of have a chip on their shoulder because they think that because everybody is sort of, at least in America or the West, is sort of tangentially familiar with the name or relatively familiar with Jesus.
I think
that
they
they've
are.
heard that means that they are familiar with it.
Well,
that is completely untrue.
I think it's true that people have heard God talk, and they maybe even have heard Jesus talk. But it's in a particular way that's not the way that the New Testament actually speaks of God and or Jesus.
Well,
Thank you.
To get down to it, it's not that proclamation of the death and resurrection of Christ, which brings that primary problem, which you guys already talked about, which is the objection. Whoa, wait a minute. You just said he rose from the dead.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I'd even say, listen, it drives me crazy. I don't have TV anymore. It's not that I'm above it. I have Netflix and every other service on the
Yeah,
planet.
you're still watching TV.
But I don't have cable. And so I don't really see, unless I'm in a hotel room, televangelist. But it's interesting to me, if you spend 10 minutes watching a televangelist in a hotel room, that televangelist will talk about God a lot. And I'm always thinking to myself, no one comes to the Father but by me.
Sure.
No one comes to the Father but by me. So how is it that I've spent 10 minutes listening to the sermon about what God wants for your life or my life or anybody's life, but I haven't heard about Christ, death and resurrection for me?
Yep.
Or for the sinners, the 10,000 sinners in your congregation or in your pew. How is it that this conversation goes on so long without the actual proclamation of the actual gospel?
Yeah, and if you compare that to sermons in the book of Acts, the contrast is night and day. Is just night and day.
I think that's a very important distinction here that I don't know, especially when I'm not familiar with a listener and somebody writing in for the first time, that I want to make sure that portion of the groundwork is laid, that we're not talking about simply winning arguments here.
No.
It really is for the purpose of proclaiming Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
Nor are we talking about converting people with apologetics. I hate that one.
Yep.
That drives me crazy. When Montgomery gets accused of this all the time. To this day, he gets accused of it.
Yeah, I've heard people say that.
Drives me crazy. If they've ever read anything or heard any of us talk that were, influenced by him at all, you'll hear us say time and time again, we know full well that it's actually only the work of the Spirit through the proclaimed word and or the sacraments that can bring a person to the faith, keep them in the faith, and sustain them in that one faith until death.
Yep.
Period. We know it. We get it. That's it. That's why we say proclaim, 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 proclaim. Okay, now defend a little bit. Proclaim, proclaim, proclaim. Okay, now defend a little bit. That's why we say that. We know that. But it's this idea that if you're proclaiming, no one will ever have an objection that requires anything but just more straight proclamation. Well, man, that's not even how the apostles did it.
Yep.
No, there was an appeal. I mean, just go look at sort of the instances throughout Acts of Paul.
Yeah, and you hear Peter say, we're not following cleverly devised myths when we make known to you the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen.
You know, that you can see it in the record. You can see it in the record.
So, well, I think it's great. We've said a couple times now that there's somewhere between 6 and 12 main objections. I also had a question, so let's maybe outline some of those. But also, I had a secondary question that'll get tagged on to the end of this. That that was, what do we think the greatest challenges for doing apologetics are now, and what sort of questions or things can somebody have in their pocket to deal with those?
Well, we're going to send out, you're going to attach Paul Little's short article, What Non-Christians Ask.
Well, and I say this is because I wouldn't call it recently, but it's recently enough since he hasn't been back from France in over a year and a half. Had an argument with Montgomery on this one, which is, I say,
I think we had that argument live on the show, actually.
Oh, okay. I actually think that in the modern conversation, while I agree with him that sort of logic and its use, we could get really particular on that, and even sort of one of the best things I've ever learned came to me by way of Rod, which came to Rod by way of Dr. Montgomery, which are these the influence of, or the helpfulness of the analytic philosophers on defining terms, right, and that type of thing. That's been really helpful to me. But I think in the modern conversation, and I hate even saying that because it's just not me to say the modern conversation. I get how timeless some of this stuff is. I really do. But there is such a... I've come to believe more it's an existential bent to the way people sort of view life rather than a strictly sort of postmodern relativist bent. It's not relativistic. It's just completely internally centered. That the conversation backs up one step, and it's just one step. And the one step that it backs up is at the point of, why, or do I believe anything, and why do I believe what I do believe? Mm-hmm. Once you've done that, once you've asked the asker that question and had them wrestle with that, you can get right on to everything I think that Dr. Montgomery does in Sensible Christianity. But for many, I'd say especially young people that I meet at the university, if they don't wrestle with that question first, you're sort of going to be talking to a wall when you get into sort of analyzing various types of evidence and whether they're trustworthy or not, because they've just never thought that way.
Yes, I agree.
Whereas I think the people that Dr. Montgomery was dealing with, 20, 30 years ago on college campuses, they had been trained to think that way. They had been trained to think in terms of evidence and logic and everything. And today they just haven't.
No.
Even by the time they're in a junior in college, they just haven't been taught to think that way. And so the apologist's task is to first teach them to think in terms of the fact that they really do base everyday decisions on evidence, and they really do have sort of a mechanism for weighing that evidence and just asking them some very basic questions to sort of get at fleshing it out in them that they do and how they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, we've done a lot of episodes on epistemology, which were some of the other questions. So I'm going to post those in the various places where people ask questions about epistemology. And I think, there have been a couple areas where people cling to the word knowledge that actually might be helpful.
Feeling.
Yeah, well, feeling is one of those. And then I would say the stark other contrast to that is people, I think, relate the word knowledge to scientific discovery or even scientific sort of proclamations or declarations, and to this day, I think that's the case. But I also think that that's people's association with science and knowledge has been abused to redefine some terms, which happens quite a bit. I mean, I've had a lot of experience where somebody uses the word evidence when they really mean speculation.
Or the opposite, say evidence when they really mean mathematics.
Yeah. And
or at least when they're actually going after, say, the type of truth statement that a geometry formula can get you.
correct. And they're trying to say that about something that's probabilistic.
Well, about something that's that's observable in real time in real space,
Yep.
like actually happening, which is, that is probability at that point, right? And
it's
just
it's a little
just so hard because the conversations have become so internal that a person is either thinking of something being 100%,
Yep.
or just a feeling, or worse yet, the only thing that can get you to 100% is a feeling.
yeah.
And so
No, I think that's a really good contrast, the 100% versus the feeling thing. And the other thing we're battling here is that in some way that the 100% is true and that the feeling is true. And the 100% has been applied to things which aren't actually 100% true. Which are probabilistic.
Can't be known to be at
yeah,
100%
be known
level.
to be, yeah.
Correct.
Just walk into a church group of old ladies and tell them that that's nonsensical.
And we should we should do that. By that we mean like you said, mathematics is something which is inherently true. So they're formulaic. 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, whether or not, I don't know what's a good example. You use crossing the street a lot, so I use that. So you can look right, look left, there's no cars coming. That's not 100% true that it's safe to cross the street.
Well, you can even throw in the look right again, right? Or look left again, because, that's a very good, it's a good example because it's got levels of verification set to it, right? So you teach a 5-year-old how to cross the street, take him to the edge of the curb, and you teach him to look left, then it's okay, it's all clear. You teach them to look right, okay, it's all clear, and then just for extra sort of verification, you have them look left again because they're on that's the side of the street where the cars will be closest to them before they step off the curb.
But anybody who's walked through the street knows there's no guarantees. I can't tell you the amount of times where I thought it was safe, and all of a sudden somebody comes busting down the street, and you got to put your hustle on and
But
get it.
that's how you're taught to verify whether or not you can risk your life on crossing that street.
Right.
People do it every day.
And most of the
they
time-
bet the house on it
Yep.
every day, and it's probabilistic.
But it's not 100% true in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4. So that's
Absolutely not.
That's what
and
we're
it's
talking
not
about here.
true to some people as much as I feel it.
And then this is the other.
I think people, and I'm a fairly stoic person, and I think that most people must have much more stable feelings than I do if they bet so much on a particular feeling.
But and
Which is weird to me because, like I said, I'm fairly even
keeled.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think at some point a lot of these conversations are with people younger than you. Some of this is just years lived where you realize that a certain amount of your emotional state is in flux based on things
Stuff
that
changes, man.
Yeah, Pete Lewis was told one time by a friend that could be a function of your sleep, could be a function of your diet, could be a function of a whole bunch of things, none of which are worth depending on.
To quote Rod Rosenblatt, that could be the pepperoni and sauerkraut pizza you had last night.
Well, and sometimes I don't want to get too off track, but sometimes a lot of people trust in a lot of that too, right? So like, if I change my diet, it'll change my life, or if I just start sleeping more.
Oh, don't go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I'm going to say this. We already did this with Dave Zoll on the Seculosity episode, but the other portion of that is like, there's a very hard way to know which one of those things it is if you're doing all those, right?
Listen,
what kept you up at night?
We should acknowledge that it's difficult to convince people of the evidentiary truth of Christianity when they believe that changing to a quote-unquote plant-based diet is probably going to save the world.
Right, yeah. I agree.
That's difficult.
You're fighting an uphill battle.
I mean, these people have changed their whole lifestyle based on no evidence, but the minute that you bring into it the idea that there could be some evidence for the miraculous event of the resurrection, you're out because this isn't, it's not, currently at that stage of the conversation, it's not about them enough.
I haven't thought about this. It would kind of be fun to go to, I don't hate vegans, okay? but there is a salvific veganism. It's not all people who choose this diet, but there's a salvific veganism out there that is trying to save the world because of climate change and plant or meat production, all this. It would be really fun to go, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to one of these people. Because that happens to us, almost on a daily basis, where somebody goes, looks at the resurrection, says extraordinary claim, needs extraordinary evidence. I kind of want to do it about any other thing that claims it's going to save the world. It's like, well, if everybody went vegan, the planet would be saved. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Show me the money.
That is an extraordinary claim.
It really is too. So, but yeah, I think so you're right.
Which we're indifferent on. It could save the world. It couldn't save the world. I just haven't seen the evidence.
Show me the evidence, baby. That's where we're at with this.
I'm also not opposed to going plant-based, so whatever.
But yeah, you went almost plant-based for a while too.
I went full-on vegetarian for 3 years.
But so I guess to go back to
anybody who's seen me then and seen me now and can just look at me and recognize I found meat again.
That's too funny, or a little too much popcorn. What this started this fun tangent was definitions, because one of the things you have to realize when you have these apologetic conversations is that when you use a term like evidence, not everybody's actually imagining or thinking the same thing, and so
that's right.
Like you said, one of the helpful things here that we lend from analytic philosophy at a basic level is saying, before we can even have this conversation, we need to understand what the terms we're about to be using are. And so if you're going to say this and you say, this is what I mean when I say the word evidence, and you have to sort of, and you have to keep your ear attuned, because I've learned that you can say that at the beginning of the conversation. Say, this is how I'm defining evidence, this is how I'm going to use it. And somebody still tries to sneak the other one back in there, and you just have to keep your ears tuned and say, no, that's speculation again, or whatever is actually happening, and sort of redefine things and be ready to do that. And so there's a couple of these terms.
Maybe illustrating with mood, bias, diet, all sorts of possibilities that are underlying the speculation.
Right. And that's, I think, what was kind of fun about this little tangent we did here, is it sort of shows in how many ways you can really sort of cling to these definitions and also demonstrate how they're not being used consistently. Okay, now back to the main question that I was trying to ask. What are those 6 to 12, somewhere in between questions that people ask?
Well, I would have made a list if I'd have known this ahead of time. Let me think about them here for half a second. I already brought one up, miracles.
Miracles make the list for sure.
It makes the list for sure.
The problem of evil.
I'll say the problem of evil.
Problem of evil.
And if I were to give you the top 2 out of, and I always say it's 6 with variance 6-ish with variance that can make it up to 12. Right?
Sure.
Because every one of these can have a bit of a variance, and sometimes people don't object to the idea of miraculous, but a big miraculous event like a resurrection of a dead person is just too much. These same people, might believe that if they have good thoughts, the spirits of the earth will descend on their sick relative and, make them better. But the minute you say a dead man came to life and this proved that he was God, that certainly makes the list. The problem of evil, which is basically, there's so many very different ways that this can work out that it's hard to say the problem of evil is basically this, but I'm going to do it anyway. The problem of evil is basically the objection that if the God we talk about when we are out there talking about God is all powerful and all good,
why is there evil?
Why does he allow evil to happen in the world?
And even not just like evil acts or people, but things as basic as sickness and death and pain and suffering.
Right.
Yep.
It's not always like your grand evil, right?
Yep.
It's sometimes more of those basic things like, why did I have to sit there and watch my mom suffer for 6 months from cancer?
Sure.
And I always say anytime we talk about this one that if you hear this objection, and even if you listen to the episodes we've done it, or Dr. Montgomery's episode or section of Sensible Christianity where he talks about it, I always say be very careful when answering this question. I always start out with Dr. Kolb's good question, which is, why do you ask that? Because likely the person who is asking you that question is asking it because their favorite Aunt June, who never seemed to sin a day in her life, was taken in a car accident when she was 38. And they can't put two and two together with that. And that's a more pastoral question now than it is intellectual objection.
Yeah, I would add on to that, because this is one of those ones where, because the way the person presents it is likely some sort of apparent contradiction within God's nature and existence, that you could tend to be either very philosophical or very dogmatic about your answer. Where this actually might be where, when your ears are tuned, one of those opportunities where somebody actually just needs the comfort of the gospel first and foremost.
Yeah.
Too, like you said, very, very pastoral. This is one of those questions where your first reaction is likely the gut reaction to go defend God, because it seems like God's honor is on the line here. When those situations come up in the scripture, he actually asks us to go preach the good word to that person.
Yeah, that's why I said it's oftentimes a pastoral question and not an actual apologetic question. Now, I hate saying that, and the reason I do is because it's sort of assuming a person's motive that they haven't, expressly stated, which that's a dangerous game to play. But if you are a person that has any empathy at all, when you ask why do you ask that question back to them, you should be able to pick up a little bit on, is this person like asking me a philosophical question here, or are they asking me a question because they're deeply hurt? Mm-hmm. So I think that's valuable. The next one, I'll put them together. I'll put sort of, I guess we're on 3 and 4-ish together. So if we're doing this the way we've said, we have already evangelized, right? We've already told people about Jesus and his death and resurrection for them, right? Mm-hmm. So the next one is going to be, what evidence is there, or how can I know that he actually rose from the dead? Is there any evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? If so, what is it? That's very, once you get like to actual resurrection of Christ, claims in your evangelistic discourse, if there is objection, it'll come up. You will, if you listen to the rest of the series, you will inevitably go to the New Testament documents, right? Which is going to lead to specifically the 4 Gospels, which are sort of the life and times of Jesus Christ. You're going to get the next one, right? Which is, how can I trust the New Testament documents? With, I guess I would put sort of the number 5 as a sub question to that, which is, how can I trust any old historical documents?
I think that's actually when somebody asks that question. So generally, the philosophy is to not introduce problems that the person doesn't already have. But when somebody starts asking questions about New Testament documents, it's actually the solution. One of the first things you do is introduce how much of a problem it's about to be for their whole world.
Right. So I would say this is my 6. I'll let Rod go after this, but this is my 6, and it's usually my 1 when I teach this, is how can we know anything at all? Or to say like Jim Sire did, why should we believe anything at all? Right?
That's a book worth mentioning at the level you're talking.
Yeah. And I think that's, in this list, it's number 6. But when I teach this, it's my number 1, because I think a lot of these, if you wrestle with that question, the other 5 fall into line more easily.
Mm-hmm. And I think by know anything at all, we're talking more sort of like not things that are outside of us, that are not we have not personally experienced. Right. I think a lot of those people are assuming that they know things that they have tangibly touched, learned, heard. Felt. And
you're going to get a couple others that tag on to, especially the evidence for the resurrection and the veracity of the New Testament documents. You're going to get things like, is there any outside evidence outside the Bible that testifies to what you're saying about Jesus? That's a very common one. And even if you say that you don't really prefer to start here or talk about this, you will get an evolution question.
Absolutely, every time.
Yeah, every time.
I always, I've been backed into that corner a little more. Little more often than I thought I would, and it's interesting because I always try to you try to hit things right straight to out of Genesis back to Jesus, and people really just want to sit there and ruminate, and what back to that word speculation. A lot of it, I just get tired of 2 hour long conversations of sort of two people speculating and not actually having any evidence to argue about. It sort of just gets old. So I'd rather go to say, can we go to something more like related, but that we can actually have a little debate about?
Well, I guess if I were to, if Rod wants to talk, interrupt me, Rod, but the more basic question, and I don't usually get this one because I always, on Rod's training and then Dr. Montgomery's training, I always go right to the resurrection of Jesus, right? It's always a gospel-oriented thing. But I know for a fact that general questions about the existence of God, more sort of broadly defined, of course that's going to be there. But I don't really like the classical proofs or classical arguments for the existence of God. To me, there's so many assumptions in most of them that it's more theoretical. You're making an argument that's it's just purely rational
and knowing in the back of your mind that the Bible itself grants salvation to no theist only. You know it, and I know it. The other person probably thinks any sort of way you fill in the blanks is salvific. It isn't.
Right. Yeah. And so that is probably one of the more common, just does God exist is probably the most common question. But if I'm doing evangelism and I get an objection, I'm already assuming that's an issue, and I'm trying to get to Christ to answer it.
Right. Well, and anecdotally, the times I've been sort of hit with that, like head on from sort of a philosophical perspective, it's usually not like good faith, and I'm usually already on the defensive because it wasn't actually an evangelistic effort. It sort of was like heaved into your court, and you can sort of engage in those classical philosophical proofs, but it is, like you said, it's so removed from Christ. Those conversations tend to devolve into a tit for tat, more frequently than I would say, presenting the resurrection of Christ as a factual historical event.
Mm-hmm. And I know that a common question for a lot of people has to do with like, is God good and stuff like that. I go right to the question of, does Jesus save?
Right.
Is God good? That's almost like a question within the realm of systematics, that once you've sort of gotten them to Jesus save and then to Jesus view of Scripture, you can sort of answer some of those questions from the Scriptures.
Well, and that's one of those questions that still, it comes back to the cross too, ultimately. So like, even if I'm going to answer the question, is God good? The way I'm going to answer that question is, generally speaking, with the death and resurrection of Christ from his creation. So,
But I guess, as a definition of good, you're using the fact that he would die for you, which is a message that's answered from the text that is difficult to answer unless you're already dealing with Jesus as God and his view of the text is trustworthy.
Yeah. And many times in the evangelistic conversation, you're going to run into, we all will, I'm basically good compared to my neighbor, for instance.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's going to be there.
Oh, sure. I say that all the time when I'm teaching in church groups. Is that the problem with that question is that our measuring stick is always ourselves.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, or the best person we know.
Yep. Yep.
Or some sort of natural theology, which is the same thing that introduced the problem of evil to the other person next to you. Right.
Yep.
So it's sort of.
Want me to read off the categories of what we're going to post online from Paul Little?
Sure.
All right. He starts out with the heathen. What about the heathen who never heard of Christ?
That's true.
Then
when I do this at the university, and not even apologetics, but when you just are doing straight evangelism at the university, or I'd even say doctrine of soteriology, that question always comes.
Sure. Then he lists the sincere Buddhists. The problem of evil he lists, science and miracles, trustworthiness of the Bible text, and I'm good enough. Those are the way the editor split up what he wrote, or what Paul himself used to split up the categories. If that sort of rings a bell within you, we'll send it to you free.
Cool. Well, I'll fill up the show notes here. I think this was another great introductory episode. I'm sorry if 2 episodes in, if you're a little disappointed that we haven't gotten to your specific question yet, but we will.
We're slow movers.
And sometimes we hop.
You should take an Augsburg confession class with me. It's supposed to be 8 weeks long.
Yeah, what are you on? Like week 16?
No, I finished it, but it was like 28.
I went to one of those lessons. It was apparent why you couldn't wrap it up. Back to this. We will get to this, but one of the things about coming back to a topic that we covered so thoroughly 3 years ago is that, if you're really excited after these 2 episodes and you haven't listened to those yet, you can go and listen to those. It's from year 1. It starts off with Introduction to Apologetics as the first episode, and as you see it, we go categorically through issues like the problem of evil, the resurrection, New Testament documents. We're going to do some of that this time. We're not going to do the full outline again because we already have it in the catalog, but we're going to hit those issues as particular questions get to them. Because one of the things about doing it as an outline is sometimes you miss the person who has it phrased differently in their head than the formal way of just categorizing, say, are the New Testament documents reliable? So I do want to hit somebody who is approaching that question just slightly different, and answer those questions directly. And so we're going to do more of that this time, so maybe we can draw some of the connections there to things that people may not have seen the first time around. And like I said, this is maybe like if you're listening to this on the Tuesday that this has come out, you probably have like 48 hours to send me a question for consideration into it, because we record ahead of time. This is being recorded several weeks before you're listening to it. So thank you for listening to this episode. Thank you for supporting us by rating the show on Apple Podcasts, and by, if you're able, signing up for monthly recurring donations to 1517. Thank you for listening to this episode. We'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.